A gray, bitterly cold winter morning in a quiet northern London suburb. The temperature hovered just above freezing, thick fog blanketing the silent little street as dim yellow street lights cast their glow over damp, glistening pavements. No one knew that inside a dingy flat at the end of the row, an 8-year-old girl had just drawn her last breath, ending a long, unbroken stretch of pain, hunger, beatings, and fear. When paramedics arrived, they found the girl curled up on a bed, so emaciated she was little more than skin and bone, her small body covered with 128 separate wounds and scars, cuts, burns, old and new bruises layered atop each other. Her face was ghostly pale, her eyes still wide open, staring blankly. Her name was Victoria Climbié, just 8 years old, from Ivory Coast, a child her parents had entrusted to others in the hope she would find a better life in Europe. But the very people her parents trusted became the ones who tortured her to death. And worse still, over the 8 months she lived in England, Victoria came under the scrutiny of 4 separate child protection agencies, 2 child protection police units, 2 hospitals, a charity, and several churches. At least 12 different occasions where she was seen, reported on, or raised as a concern. Yet no one acted in time. One by one, they all looked away. Every chance to save her slipped through their fingers. Victoria Climbié's death did more than outrage Britain over the cruelty of her abusers. It posed a chilling question. How could an entire child protection system, with laws, protocols, and trained professionals, stand by and let a child slowly die before their eyes? This is the story of Victoria Climbié, of how an innocent child endured hell on earth in the heart of a civilized society, and how her death finally forced Britain to wake up and change. Before we dive deeper into this case, I'd like to know, where are you watching this video from? Is it morning, afternoon, or night where you are? How's the weather today? Let me know in the comments below. I always take time to read each of your thoughts. And if you appreciate true stories like this one, told slowly, in detail, and unflinchingly, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Stories like this don't just help you understand more. They just might help save another child somewhere in the world. Thank you for being here. And now, let's begin. On November 1, 1991, in Abobo, a poor working-class district in northern Abidjan, Ivory Coast, Victoria Adjo Climbié was born. She was the 5th of 7 children of Francis Climbié and Berthe Amoisi, growing up in a cramped little home filled with laughter and her parents' quiet love. Dark-skinned and bright-eyed, she was a lively, polite little girl who was always running, always smiling. Her parents didn't have much, but they shared one simple dream, that if their children could get an education, they might have a better future than they did. Then, one afternoon in October 1998, fate came knocking. Marie-Thérèse Kouao, a distant relative on Francis's side, returned from France to attend her brother's funeral. The woman, Victoria's great-aunt, was born in 1956 and had lived in France for years. She carried herself with confidence, generosity, and stories of her successful life abroad. In truth, back in France, she was struggling, living on government welfare, divorced since 1978, widowed since 1995, raising 3 sons in difficult conditions. But in the eyes of her family in Abidjan, she was a Western woman, someone with money, status, and, most importantly, the means to offer a child a better life. Inside the Climbié home, Kouao made her pitch, her voice warm and convincing. "Let me take one of the children to France. I'll raise her, send her to school. She'll have a future." In many African families, sending a child to live with a better-off relative abroad was not unusual. Francis and Bert didn't hesitate for long. Initially, Kouao had planned to take another girl named Anna, a child from her own side of the family. But at the last moment, Anna's parents changed their minds. So instead, Kouao turned to Victoria. The little girl, then nearly 7, lit up, her eyes sparkling with excitement. She thought she was about to go to Europe, to walk the wide streets she'd seen in old photographs, to study and live a dream. She had no idea what awaited her was not a dream, but a nightmare beyond her worst imaginings. Her parents, though heavy-hearted, watching their daughter clutch her little bag next to Kawao, smiled and reassured her. They truly believed that their cousin would care for their child as her own. They scraped together what they could to buy her a few new clothes, prepared her papers, and sent her off with all the hope and trust they could muster. But the deception had already begun. To ease Victoria's entry into France, Kawao falsified her documents, using the name Anna Kawao, the name of the girl she'd originally intended to take. Victoria was made to wear a wig, respond to a false name, and carry a false identity that would follow her for the rest of her short life. On paper, Victoria Climbié had already disappeared. In her place was a girl named Anna Kawao. In November 1998, Victoria left her homeland, stepping off the plane at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris with a crooked wig, a new sweater still carrying the dust of Abidjan, and a pair of bright, hopeful eyes fixed on the future. A new chapter of her life began, but it was not the fairy tale she imagined. It was the beginning of a path straight into hell. At first, life in Paris seemed calm, maybe even hopeful. Just weeks after arriving in late 1998, Marie-Thérèse Kawao enrolled Victoria, still under the false name Anna Kawao, at a local elementary school. The little girl began to adjust to her strange, new surroundings. Chilly mornings, a foreign language, unfamiliar faces. In those early days, Kawao still played the part of a caring mother, walking her to school, responding to the teacher's requests, answering questions with confidence. On paper, and in the eyes of the school, she was nothing more than a devoted single mother, helping her daughter settle into a better life. But the illusion didn't last long. By December 1998, warning signs began to appear. Victoria started missing classes, at first sporadically, then more often without explanation. By early 1999, her absences became so frequent that teachers grew worried. In February 1999, after repeated warnings sent home when unanswered, the school formally flagged her as a child at risk and contacted the local social services. For the first time, Victoria, or rather, Anna, was officially on the child protection radar. But that wasn't all. In class, teachers noticed she would often fall asleep at her desk, head slumped over, as though too weak to stay upright. At 7 years old, most children are bundles of restless energy. But Victoria seemed too tired to even move. When questioned, Kawao offered a quick explanation. The child, she claimed, suffered from a skin disease, scabies, that made her itchy, uncomfortable, and unable to sleep. It sounded plausible enough on the surface, and the teachers reluctantly believed her. Until that day. On March 25, 1999, Victoria's last day at school in France, she arrived with her head completely shaved and wearing a cheap, ill-fitting wig. The sight of a 7-year-old girl, small and frail, sitting in class with a wig sliding on her scalp sent chills through the staff. When asked, Kawao repeated the same excuse. Because of her skin condition, we had to shave her hair. Nobody pressed further, but uneasy glances began to pass between the teachers. And then, suddenly, she was gone. Just days later, at the end of March 1999, Victoria stopped coming to school. Her mother never left a word of explanation. It would be months before the truth emerged. By then, Marie-Thérèse Kawao's carefully constructed life in France had begun to unravel. She owed nearly $2,000, over $3,000, in fraudulent welfare payments after the authorities caught her lying about her children to collect benefits. The payments stopped, the debts piled up, and she was evicted for failing to pay her rent. Under scrutiny, angry and desperate, she decided to flee, and she wasn't about to leave behind the little tool she used to claim benefits. In April 1999, Kawao packed her bags, grabbed Victoria by the hand, and boarded a ferry or train across the channel, bound for London. The little girl, just 7.5 years old, stepped off into the streets of London wearing a crooked wig, clutching her tiny bag, unaware that life here would not be the start of her dream, but the door to the darkest chapter of her short life. On April 24, 1999, Marie-Thérèse Kawao and little Victoria, traveling under the false name Anna, arrived in London. At first glance, it might have seemed like a fresh start in a grand, bustling city. But in reality, it was simply the next chapter in a web of lies, carefully spun months earlier. They settled temporarily in Acton, in the borough of Ealing, West London. There, the two rented a shabby little room in a bed and breakfast on Twyford Crescent. The space was small, dark, damp. The thin metal bed frame groaned with every turn Victoria made under the threadbare sheets. They stayed there just 1 week, from the end of April to May 1st. But from the moment she set down her bags, Kuao had already launched the next phase of her plan, to secure council housing and benefits from the British welfare system. The very next day, April 25th, Kuao led Victoria to visit Esther Aka, a distant relative by marriage, living in London. Aka was an experienced midwife, a trusted counselor, and a respected pastor in her community. When she opened her door to them, her eyes and those of her daughter were immediately drawn to the frail little girl trailing behind Kuao. Victoria looked painfully small, her shoulders hunched, her movements timid. Most striking was the ill-fitting wig sitting crookedly on her head. She did not look like a healthy, robust African child one might expect. She looked weak, malnourished, and hesitant, the very picture of a child who had already learned to retreat into herself. Aka felt a vague unease as she studied her. Why would a little girl, no more than 7, have to wear a wig? Is this child healthy? Is something wrong? But, as always, Kuao quickly put any doubts to rest. Flashing her usual confidence, she explained that Victoria was simply a bit sick, being treated for a skin condition, but nothing serious. She promised Aka she was taking good care of her niece. For the moment, Aka chose to believe her. She offered some brief words of caution and kindness, but even as she closed the door behind them, the image of the silent little girl, head down and wig askew, lingered heavily in her mind. The next day, April 26th, Kuao pressed forward with her plan. She took Victoria to the Ealing Council Homeless Persons Unit and presented her case to Julie Winter, the officer on duty. Kuao claimed they had only just arrived from France, had no permanent home, and needed social housing. When asked about the wig, Kuao replied smoothly, "She's embarrassed because her hair is so short. I bought her the wig to make her feel better." Winter accepted the explanation without question. She helped Kuao fill out the application for council housing, never suspecting that the French passport in front of her, with the photo of another little girl named Anna, was fraudulent. After reviewing the file, Winter determined that Kuao did not meet the residency requirements for long-term housing. She double-checked with her supervisor and then regretfully informed Kuao that Ealing Council could not offer her accommodation. Still, something about the pale, quiet child sitting in the waiting room gnawed at her conscience. So Winter picked up the phone and called Pamela Fortune, a social worker with Acton's intake and assessment team, to alert them about the case and see if they could help. But unfortunately, she only called. She never wrote a note. She never filed a formal report. No record of the referral was ever made, and her call vanished into thin air. And so, another chance to see Victoria's true circumstances, and possibly save her, was lost. After the April 26 meeting, Marie-Thérèse Kuao did not stop. Even though her application for council housing had been rejected, she kept returning to the Ealing Social Services office regularly, pressing her case for help. Between late April and early July 1999, Kuao appeared at the office no fewer than 18 times. On at least 10 of those occasions, Victoria was with her, sitting quietly in the waiting room, barely making a sound. Over time, the staff grew accustomed to seeing the two of them. But what struck many wasn't just how often they came. It was the girl herself. The crooked wig, the disheveled clothes, the hollow, listless expression. Deborah Gaunt, a social worker there, later recalled,
"I was startled when I first saw that child. She looked exactly like the malnourished children you see in charity posters about famine."
But instead of taking action, people whispered. Some employees speculated that Kuao was deliberately making the girl look pitiful to gain sympathy and have her case approved faster. They regarded the child's misery as a ploy. And so they turned away. No reports were made. No one checked further. By early June, Kowal had landed a job at Northwick Park Hospital in the canteen. Yet more than 2 months into her time in England, Victoria was still not enrolled in school. Kowal never signed her up, and, tragically, no one at Ealing thought to ask or advise her about it. A 7-year-old who should have been sitting in a classroom was instead left to drift around aimlessly, unmonitored, invisible. On June 8th, as soon as she started her new job, Kowal took Victoria to register at a local GP clinic. But the medical staff only noted that she had no acute illness. No one conducted a full physical exam. No one saw the bruises or the cuts. Another opportunity slipped away. Around the same time, Kowal began leaving Victoria in the care of a part-time babysitter while she worked. That was Priscilla Cameron, a woman who also worked in the hospital canteen and took on childcare to supplement her income. In Cameron's eyes, Victoria was a quiet, obedient child who rarely drew attention. But on a few occasions, while bathing the girl, she noticed small cuts on her fingers. When she asked Kowal about it, the response was casual. She was playing with razor blades. Cameron, reluctant to interfere too deeply, accepted the explanation, though it rang hollow. By mid-June, Kowal and Victoria ran into Esther Aka again on the street. This time, Aka was shocked to see a large scar on Victoria's cheek. "What happened to her?" she demanded. Kowal answered immediately. She fell on an escalator. That's all. But the explanation did not sit right with Aka. 3 days later, on June 17th, Aka decided to visit the flat Kowal and Victoria had rented on Nickel Road in Harlesden, in Brent, where they had been living since early May. The flat was filthy, cluttered, oppressive. Aka couldn't shake the thought, how can a child live in this environment? The unease in her heart only deepened. On June 18th, Aka finally broke her silence. She called Brent's one-stop shop social services center anonymously and expressed her fears about the child's safety. Samantha Hunt took the call. Recognizing this as a possible case of child abuse, Hunt filled out a referral form and faxed it to the Brent Child Protection Team that same day. But no one read it. The fax, inexplicably, was overlooked, lost in a pile of papers, stuck in the machine, or simply ignored. Sir William Laming, who later led the public inquiry, called this one of the most bizarre and tragic examples of bureaucratic failure. No one at Brent could say what had happened to that crucial document. A few days later, Aka called back, likely on June 21st, to ask for an update. The person who answered gave a vague reply. They're probably dealing with it. Thinking things were being handled, Aka did not pursue it further. But in reality, no one at Brent had done anything. And so another chance to save Victoria slipped away. On July 6, 1999, nearly 3 weeks after Esther Aka made her anonymous call reporting Victoria's condition, the fax that Samantha Hunt had sent on June 18th was finally discovered. A clerical worker named Robert Smith happened to find the document buried in a pile of paperwork and entered the details into the system, noting the descriptions of Victoria's injuries Aka had reported. Sir William Laming would later remark, 18 days during which a child in pain was completely forgotten. It was a chance to save her, squandered through carelessness. But even after the file was entered, the mishandling continued. Edward Armstrong, the duty team manager at Brent, who should have acted immediately, claimed he had already dealt with a different referral dated June 21st, not the June 18th fax. Armstrong argued that the June 21st case was less serious and that he had merely recorded it on a duty action sheet. Sir Laming, when reviewing his testimony, dismissed it outright. That account is wholly incredible. No such June 21st referral exists. Other staff at Brent confirmed there had only been one referral, the June 18th fax, and it had simply been ignored for far too long. Laming suspected Armstrong fabricated the June 21st story to cover up his team's sloppy handling of a critical child protection case. In fact, on July 7th, Brent still continued to go through the motions as though nothing was amiss. The Social Services Office mailed a letter to Kowal's old address on Nicole Road, informing her that a home visit was scheduled. But by then, she and Victoria had already left. The letter never reached them. On July 14th, two Brent social workers, Lori Hobbs and Monica Bridgman, arrived at the Nicole Road flat to conduct their home check. No one answered. The landlord told them matter-of-factly, "They moved out last week." Instead of trying to find out where they had gone, asking neighbors, or coordinating with other boroughs, Hobbs and Bridgman simply returned to their office, jotting down a single note in the file. "No longer at this address. Has moved. No further report. No follow-up." The file fell silent again. In reality, while Brent was fumbling to even notice the facts, a pivotal event in Victoria's life had already taken place, one that would seal her fate. On June 14, 1999, aboard a routine bus route, Victoria and Kawau boarded a bus driven by 26-year-old Carl Manning. Kawau quickly struck up a conversation with him. Confident and forward, she easily captivated the young, single man, someone who had never even had a girlfriend and still dreamed of his first real relationship. Within weeks, their relationship escalated quickly. Manning became completely infatuated with the older woman and her story of struggling to care for a little girl. Then, on July 6th, the very same day the Brent fax was finally logged into the system, Kawau moved herself and Victoria into Manning's one-bedroom flat at Somerset Gardens in Tottenham, in the borough of Haringey, North London. It was a horrifying turning point. From the moment they moved into that flat, the abuse intensified noticeably. Victoria had already endured so much, but living with Manning made it even worse. From that point on, Victoria completely vanished from Brent's radar. And tragically, she never properly appeared in Haringey's records either. There was no notice, no handover between boroughs. The deadly cracks in the child protection system yawned wide open, and Victoria fell straight through them. Picture Victoria's circumstances now. In the sweltering London summer, the 7.5-year-old girl and Kawau moved into a cramped one-bedroom flat at Somerset Gardens, Tottenham, the home of the man Kawau had met only weeks earlier. Carl Manning. From the very first days, the atmosphere in the flat was tense, oppressive. With only one bedroom, Victoria almost certainly had to sleep on the floor or in the living room. Manning, by his own later admission, never wanted a child in his home. Though he fancied Kawau, he resented having to share his space and his life with Victoria. For Kawau, the little girl she had never truly loved now became nothing more than an obstacle, a burden that stood in the way of her relationship. And so began a new chapter in Victoria's ordeal, a darker one as both Kawau and Manning escalated their abuse. On July 13th, barely a week after moving to Tottenham, Kawau sought out Priscilla Cameron again, the informal babysitter who had watched Victoria in the past. This time, Kawau practically begged Cameron to take Victoria in permanently, claiming that Manning didn't want the child in the house. She even offered to leave Victoria there all day, even overnight, and pick her up only when it suited her. Cameron refused. She was no professional childminder, nor did she have the means to care for Victoria full-time. But moved by pity for the frightened little girl, and unable to turn her away completely, she agreed to keep Victoria overnight that evening. That night, July 13th, as Cameron and her two children, Patrick and Avril, helped Victoria settle in, they finally saw the full extent of her injuries. They were stunned. A fresh burn marked her face. The skin on her right eyelid dangled loose, and her arms and legs were covered with a web of bruises and cuts, old and new layered together. Cameron demanded, "What happened to you?" But Victoria stayed silent, eyes cast down. She was too afraid to speak, just as Kawau had warned her. Earlier, Kawau had casually told Cameron, "She does it to herself." A chilling, nonsensical excuse. That night, Cameron lay awake, unable to shake the image of Victoria's broken body. She knew no child could do that to themselves. And she decided Victoria needed to see a doctor immediately. The next morning, July 14th, Avril, Cameron's daughter, took Victoria to meet a friend, Marie Cater, a French teacher at Avril's son's school. The moment Cater saw Victoria, she gasped in horror. "She needs to go to the hospital right now." Without hesitation, Avril bundled Victoria into the car and drove straight to the emergency department at Middlesex Central Hospital. At 11 a.m. on July 14, 1999, Avril Cameron carried Victoria into the emergency department of Middlesex Central Hospital. The little girl was silent, her eyes vacant, her small frame swallowed up in the busy waiting room. By 11:50, senior emergency physician Rhys Bainan personally took the case. Avril quickly explained. This was the niece of a friend, bearing suspicious injuries, likely a victim of abuse. One glance was enough for Bainan to see something was terribly wrong. Burns, lacerations, bruises, telltale signs of non-accidental injuries, NAI. He wasted no time, immediately referred Victoria to the pediatric team for a more thorough assessment. Victoria was moved to the hospital's Barnaby Bear Pediatric Ward, where Dr. Ekundayo Ajayi-Obe examined her from head to toe. The sight left her shaken, burns on the head, small cuts, scars old and new interwoven. The little girl's body was a roadmap of violence. Gently, Ajayi-Obe asked, "Why do you have these injuries?" Victoria lowered her eyes and whispered, "I did it to myself." The exact script Kowau had drilled into her. But Ajayi-Obe knew better. No 7-year-old could inflict such complex, widespread injuries on herself. She concluded unequivocally, this was a clear case of severe abuse. Around midday, Victoria was formally admitted to the hospital. Doctors promptly alerted Brent Police and local social services. Officers arrived and placed Victoria under a police protection order, a 72-hour emergency measure to ensure the child could not be removed from the hospital during the investigation. Kowau showed up at the hospital soon after. She appeared calm, utterly unfazed by the sight of her battered child lying in a hospital bed. Instead, she spun her story. Victoria had scabies, she claimed, an itchy skin condition, and had scratched herself raw. A blatant lie, yet delivered with such brazenness that some present almost believed it. Several nurses doubted her explanation. Scabies could not account for burns, for old scars, for this level of injury. But then came the verdict from the highest authority that day. Dr. Ruby Schwartz, the consultant pediatrician in charge of child protection at the hospital. After glancing through the chart and listening to Kowau, Schwartz agreed. It was just scabies. She never spoke privately with Victoria, never probed further, never questioned the child's demeanor. She simply looked, nodded, and decided, no abuse here. That misjudgment changed everything. A junior doctor even sent a letter to social services affirming there are no child protection concerns in this case. Michelle Hine, the Brent social worker who had been preparing to open a child protection file, stood down. Hearing that Dr. Schwartz concluded it was scabies, she downgraded the urgency of the case. The very people tasked with protecting Victoria had turned their backs, sending her straight back into the hands of her abusers. On July 15th, just over 24 hours after being admitted, Victoria was discharged and collected by Kowau. No one stopped her. No one investigated further. The best chance to save her was gone, and the nightmare continued. When Kowau collected Victoria from the hospital on July 15, 1999, everyone assumed the matter was settled. In truth, it had only just begun its final horrific descent. Back at the cramped Tottenham flat, the two adults no longer bothered to hide their cruelty. Kowau grew more violent as she became more fearful that Victoria might somehow jeopardize her fragile relationship with Manning. And Manning himself, in his later diary, he called Victoria Satan, writing chillingly that, no matter how hard I hit her, she doesn't cry, doesn't flinch, just stands there. Those words revealed a girl so terrorized she no longer even dared to react. Within days, Kowau stopped taking Victoria to hospitals, no matter how badly she was injured. Instead, she began seeking solutions through religion. She started telling neighbors Victoria was possessed by evil spirits, that the wounds on her body were inflicted by demons. She took Victoria to the Mission Ensemble pour Christ Church in Tottenham, asking Pastor Pascal Orome to perform an exorcism. Orome and his congregation prayed over Victoria, convinced by Kowau's story that the girl was under demonic attack. They never suspected the woman standing before them was the true source of her pain. But Kowau didn't stop there. She also brought Victoria to a branch of the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God. There, Pastor Alvaro Lima immediately suspected abuse. It was obvious, he later admitted, that no child could injure herself like that. Yet even he failed to act. He simply prayed for her. When he asked Victoria what had happened, she meekly replied, "Satan told me to set myself on fire," echoing the script Kawau had forced into her. Everyone who could have saved her, the pastors, the church members, the community, chose to believe in the devil rather than face the human evil right in front of them. Meanwhile, the child protection system continued to fail. After her second hospital admission, late July, Victoria's file was bounced from one borough to another, Brent, Enfield, then Haringey, each office only seeing its own narrow piece of the puzzle. Haringey Social Services assigned her case to Lisa Arthurworry, a 24-year-old trainee with less than 2 years' experience. Arthurworry and police officer Karen Jones were scheduled to visit Kawau's home on August 4th, but they canceled at the last minute, deciding it was probably just scabies. On August 6th, hearing Kawau's absurd explanation that Victoria had poured boiling water on herself because she was itchy, Arthurworry and Jones still allowed her to remain in Kawau's custody. The very next day, August 7th, Kawau returned to Ealing Social Services, complaining again about housing. They treated it as a housing matter only, closed her case, and moved on. And so, Victoria was passed from office to office, hospital to hospital, church to church, each seeing just a fragment of her suffering, none reaching out to stop it. There were so many chances to save that little girl. Eyes saw, ears heard, but no hands reached out. By that winter, Victoria's hell reached its final, unimaginable depths. By the fall of 1999, Victoria had completely descended into hell. After Marie-Thérèse Kawau moved in with her new boyfriend, Carl Manning, a 26-year-old bus driver she had met by chance on his bus in mid-June, the cramped flat in Tottenham quickly became Victoria's prison. From the moment Kawau brought Victoria into the one-bedroom flat that July, Manning had made it clear he didn't want the child there. To him, she was nothing but a burden, an obstacle to his relationship with Kawau. At first, he managed to restrain himself, but by autumn, his true nature began to show. As the cold months crept in, Manning became increasingly cruel and detached. He fixated on one thing: Victoria wetting herself. Anyone who understands children knows this is a common response to relentless fear and trauma. But to Manning, it was an unforgivable humiliation. Around October 1999, he came up with a horrifying punishment. He forced Victoria to sleep in the bathtub. Every night, she was shoved into a black garbage bag with only her head sticking out and left to sleep curled up in the cold enamel tub. Manning claimed it was to keep things clean, so she would lie in her own urine rather than soil the sheets. That bathtub became Victoria's prison. That trash bag became a dark cocoon, smothering what little hope she still carried. In the freezing London winter, no one heard her muffled cries. Just a 7-year-old girl shivering in the dark, silently enduring until dawn. As Manning grew more vicious, Kawau began to worry. She knew that if Victoria died or was taken by authorities, she'd lose her claim to housing and welfare. But keeping the girl around only infuriated Manning further, and the risk of exposure loomed larger every day. One day, in late October 1999, during a home visit, social worker Lisa Arthurworry inadvertently planted a cruel idea in Kawau's mind. She explained that social housing was severely limited and only families with children at serious risk were prioritized. 3 days later, Kawau called Arthurworry, her voice calm but calculated. She accused Carl Manning of sexually abusing Victoria. Arthurworry was stunned. Such a serious allegation required immediate criminal investigation. She reported it to police officer Karen Jones, who promptly sent a letter summoning Kawau and Victoria to the station for questioning. But less than 24 hours later, Kawau called again, this time to retract her accusation. She coolly claimed it had all been a misunderstanding and that Manning was innocent. It was clear this was a test, a way to put pressure on the system and gain attention. But when she realized the police might probe deeper and uncover the real injuries Victoria bore, she backed down. Tragically, such a serious allegation should have triggered a full investigation regardless of her retraction. But once again, the system failed. Karen Jones let the matter drop. Her letter was ignored. Nothing further was done. Sergeant Alan Hodges, who later oversaw the investigation, said bitterly, "The Haringey social workers obstructed us in our efforts to protect this child." Through December 1999 and January 2000, Arthur Worry made 3 attempts to visit the Tottenham flat. Each time, the door was locked. Kowal was deliberately avoiding her. Arthur Worry reported this to her supervisor, Carol Baptiste, who quickly noted in the case file, "Family has left the area." There was no proof, just a guess. But it downgraded the case's priority. On February 18, 2000, Haringey Social Services sent one final letter to Kowal's last known address, warning that the case would be closed if they received no response. Of course, Kowal never replied. And so, on February 25, 2000, Victoria Clambier's child protection case was officially closed. Perhaps in a drab office that day, someone simply pressed "close case" on their computer, relieved to be rid of yet another problem. But no one knew that on that very day, February 25, 2000, Victoria Climbier, frail and broken at 7 years old, took her last breath after months of relentless, unspeakable abuse. There had been chances to save her, but one by one, they slipped away. And finally, the last door closed, along with her life. February 24, 2000, a bitterly cold winter day in London. In the small, cramped flat in Tottenham, Victoria Climbier was little more than a shadow of herself. Emaciated, unconscious, she lay limp in the bathtub, which had become her prison for months. For days, she had burned with fever, her body in a state of hypothermia and organ failure. Her skin was covered in sores, most likely infected, and her frail frame was giving out. Any talk of scabies no longer mattered. Victoria was dying, quietly and alone, in a pool of her own waste. Marie-Thérèse Kowal seemed to realize her niece would not survive the night. But letting her die at home would mean having to explain a body to the authorities. Perhaps thinking of saving herself, Kowal decided to carry Victoria to the church, hoping, maybe, for a miracle, or at least that someone in the religious community would help shield her from blame. That evening, Kowal carried Victoria, limp and icy to the touch, into the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God. Those inside were horrified. Before them was a child, nothing but skin and bones, barely breathing. The pastors and congregants urged Kowal to get her to a hospital immediately. Instead of calling emergency services, someone summoned a private minicab. But when the driver arrived and saw Victoria, he froze. What he saw was shocking. A skeletal child, unconscious, covered in wounds, her temperature dangerously low. Realizing there was no time to lose, he drove her straight to the nearby Tottenham ambulance station for immediate professional help. The paramedics there were stunned. They quickly placed Victoria on a stretcher and rushed her to the A&E department at North Middlesex Hospital. But even there, doctors saw her condition was too severe and transferred her to the ICU at St. Mary's Hospital, a top trauma center in London. On the way, the ambulance crew noted the behavior of the 2 adults. Kowal kept wailing, "My daughter, my daughter," but it sounded hollow, rehearsed, devoid of real anguish. Manning stood there silently, his face blank, showing no signs of concern or affection, never even looking at Victoria. He was like he wasn't even there, one paramedic recalled. Despite the doctor's best efforts, it was far too late. Less than 24 hours later, at 3:15 p.m. on February 25, 2000, Victoria Climbier took her final breath in the ICU at St. Mary's Hospital. She died, utterly alone in agony, without her real parents at her side, only her abusers standing by, pretending. The forensic pathologist who examined her body was horrified. "This is the worst case of child abuse I have ever seen in my career," she said. Victoria's body bore 128 separate injuries and scars. At least 128 individual blows, burns, cuts, scalds, restraints. When she died, she weighed only around 18-20 kilo, severely malnourished for an 8-year-old. Even more chilling, In her 10 months in the UK, Victoria had been seen by no fewer than 12 different agencies, 4 local authorities, 2 child protection police units, 2 hospitals, 1 NSPCC center, and multiple churches. 12 opportunities to save her, all missed. Her body was flown home to the Ivory Coast, laid to rest in Grand Bassam, near where she was born. A short, tragic life ended where it began. But the story was far from over. That very day, police arrested Marie-Thérèse Kawau at the hospital. The next day, Carl Manning was also in custody. During questioning, Kawau feigned grief, crying, "It's terrible. I just lost my daughter." Manning was quiet, almost cold, perhaps realizing his crimes had finally caught up with him. Justice had begun to turn. The case of Victoria Clymier quickly became the center of national attention. The agonizing death of an 8-year-old girl and the abject failure of the entire child protection system outraged the public. On November 20th, 2000, the trial of Marie-Thérèse Kawau and Carl Manning formally opened at the Old Bailey in London. Long queues of reporters, members of the public, and professionals from social services filed into the courtroom to follow every development. The 2 defendants faced the most serious charges: murder and child cruelty. Kawau remained defiant, denying everything. She claimed she never abused Victoria, that she loved the child, and insisted all the injuries were self-inflicted. Throughout the trial, she continued playing the part of a grieving mother. Manning was colder. He admitted part of his guilt, acknowledging he abused Victoria, but denied murder, attempting to plead down to manslaughter in hopes of a lighter sentence. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. The most damning piece was a diary kept by Carl Manning, discovered by police in the Tottenham flat. In it, he referred to Victoria as Satan, blaming her for all his troubles. He wrote that no matter how hard he hit her, she never cried, and that made him even angrier. Manning's scrawled words exposed his warped, sadistic mind and painted a chilling picture of the violence Victoria endured. In court, prosecutors showed photographs of Victoria's body, over 128 distinct wounds and scars documented by the pathologist. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Many people wept. Some jurors had to step outside to compose themselves. Even seasoned police officers bowed their heads. Dozens of witnesses were called: doctors, nurses, police officers, social workers, pastors, all of whom had come into contact with Victoria during her 10 short months in England. Their testimony laid bare the systemic negligence and willful blindness of those charged with protecting her. The presiding judge could barely contain his anger. He called it an act of cruelty almost beyond belief, and rebuked the catastrophic failings of the child protection agencies. People were blind in their incompetence. This child was seen, was touched, was warned about, and yet she was handed back into the hands of her abusers. For nearly 2 months, the horrifying secrets of the Tottenham flat unfolded. Manning punishing Victoria in a trash bag in the bathtub. Kawau spinning tales of demons possessing her niece, and both inflicting daily torment. Neither showed genuine remorse. On January 12, 2001, the jury returned its verdict. Both Marie-Thérèse Kawau and Carl Manning were found guilty of murder and child cruelty. The judge sentenced them both to life imprisonment. In his sentencing remarks, he said, "What Victoria endured was truly beyond imagination. She died a lonely, drawn-out, painful death. No child should ever have to endure such a fate, and no civilized society should ever allow it to happen." Marie-Thérèse Kawau sat in silence. Her charade was over. Carl Manning stood pale, head bowed. Kawau was sent to HM Prison Durham, a women's facility. Manning was sent to HM Prison Wakefield, which houses some of Britain's most dangerous offenders. The trial concluded, but Victoria Climbier's story did not end there. Her death ignited a firestorm over how such a tragedy could happen under the watch of so many. The public demanded answers. Who was responsible? And more importantly, how could the system be fixed to ensure it never happened again? Less than 2 months after Victoria Climbier's horrifying death, on April 20, 2000, the British government announced a nationwide public inquiry. Health Secretary Alan Milburn and Home Secretary Jack Straw jointly signed the order appointing Lord William Laming, former Chief Inspector of Social Services, to lead. It was unprecedented. 2 cabinet ministers working together to authorize a public inquiry into a child protection case, proof of the outrage Victoria's case had unleashed and the public demand for answers. Lord Laming insisted the inquiry be fully open. The truth must come to light. Nothing hidden, he declared. The hearings were held at Hannibal House in Elephant and Castle, London, supported by a legal team led by Neil Garnham as chief counsel. A dedicated website published all documents, reflecting a commitment to transparency. The inquiry unfolded in 2 phases. Phase 1, from September 2001 to July 2002, called 270 witnesses, doctors, social workers, police officers, managers, council executives, ministers, to account for their actions and omissions. Phase 2, from March to April 2002, brought together experts to propose systemic reforms. From the outset, Lord Laming's appointment was controversial. He himself had led a social services department during a child abuse scandal in 1990. One bereaved father in that earlier case bluntly asked, how can he investigate another failing system when his own department failed? But the government stood by Laming, trusting his experience and independence. And then, under the harsh lights of the hearing room, the cracks in the system widened. Counsel after counsel, witness after witness, report after report revealed incompetence, negligence, and a culture of blame shifting. Haringey, directly responsible for Victoria at the time of her death, was caught submitting documents late, even altering records to minimize its own responsibility. Lord Laming angrily called this a blatant contempt of justice. Brent Council fared no better. Its team leader, Edward Armstrong, had actually been banned from working with children in 1993 for misconduct. Yet by 1999, he was still supervising intake of children's cases, a chilling indictment of lax oversight. As hours of testimony mounted, the picture became clear. Frontline workers were overworked, undertrained, poorly supervised. Hundreds of children in both Brent and Haringey were left unassigned to a caseworker. Meanwhile, both councils had diverted tens of millions of pounds from child welfare budgets to cover deficits elsewhere. Senior officials claimed nothing could have been done to save Victoria. Counsel Neil Garnham cut through their excuses. Admitting mistakes is the foundation of progress, something few here seem capable of. Racial and cultural sensitivities also came under scrutiny. Several of the frontline workers were themselves black and admitted they had been reluctant to challenge what they misread as Afro-Caribbean cultural norms, mistaking Victoria's fear and submission for respect. One advocate called it cultural insensitivity under the guise of cultural sensitivity. Garnham's opening statement laid it bare. Race may well have played a role. On the front lines, social worker Lisa Arthurworry was grilled for believing Kowow's lies and failing to connect obvious signs of abuse. But she pushed back. She had been left unsupported, overburdened, and inadequately trained, handling far too many cases for a relatively inexperienced worker. Her supervisor, Carol Baptiste, initially ignored a summons and finally appeared only under threat of penalty. Her testimony was rambling and incoherent, claiming mental health issues and personal turmoil at the time. She admitted she never properly reviewed Victoria's file. Her successor, Angela Mayers, was also criticized for failing to even read the case history properly. Yet another weak link. Even the police were found wanting. Budget cuts to child protection units in the late 1990s left them understaffed and ineffective. A detective inspector overseeing 6 child protection teams claimed he had no operational role, only to be contradicted by his own superior, who accused him of lying under oath. At one hearing, a woman in the public gallery hurled ink over him in fury, a stark image of public outrage. In one unprecedented moment, Marie-Thérèse Kouao herself appeared to testify, the first convicted murderer ever to give evidence at such an inquiry. She ranted incoherently, switching between French and English, still proclaiming her innocence. No one believed her. Carl Manning, appearing via live video from prison, struck a very different note. He appeared remorseful, accepted full blame, and even tried to absolve the agencies of responsibility. But his belated contrition could not undo what he'd done. In the most gut-wrenching moments of the hearings, Victoria's parents, Francis and Berthe Clémier, flew in from Côte d'Ivoire. As photographs of their daughter's horrific injuries flashed across the screen, her mother sobbed and wailed in anguish. Her father sat frozen in grief. Every witness in the room fell silent as their pain filled the air. Lord Laming closed this phase of the inquiry with chilling clarity. This is not just the story of one child who died. This is the story of how we, the adults, let her die. The inquiry would continue into its final phase, proposing reforms to ensure no other child would suffer as Victoria had. But the scars of her short, brutalized life and the system's collective failure would never fully heal. On January 28, 2003, nearly 2 years after Victoria's death, the official inquiry report, led by Lord William Laming, was presented to Parliament. The nearly 400-page report, with 108 recommendations, laid bare a painful truth. At least 12 separate chances to save Victoria's life were missed by those who were supposed to protect her. Lord Laming did not mince words. The higher up you go, the more skilled people become at shifting blame and avoiding responsibility. He called it a failure of the entire system: healthcare, police, social services, even charities. On the day of the report's release, Berthe, Victoria's mother, wept and sang her daughter's favorite hymn, silencing the room. The report demanded sweeping reforms, establishing national and local children's boards, creating a national database of at-risk children, raising ethical and training standards for social workers. It also warned against blind cultural sensitivity, which had led many to dismiss Victoria's fear and obedience as mere family tradition, rather than a cry for help. Public reaction was intense. Some praised the thoroughness of the report, others criticized it as overly procedural, failing to address deeper issues like poor working conditions, low pay, and understaffing. Many were outraged that senior managers emerged unscathed, while frontline workers were made scapegoats. Lord Laming stood by his findings. It's the old way of working that is truly bureaucratic. Without change, children like Victoria will continue to die. That day, the white flower Berthe laid on the table reminded everyone this was more than just a report. It was a child's final plea, demanding an answer. Are we truly ready to protect the next Victoria? The story of Victoria Clémier is not just a personal tragedy. It is a mirror reflecting the darkest side of human nature and the paralyzing silence of the very systems built to protect children. In her short 8 years of life, Victoria endured unimaginable horrors: beaten, burned, starved, humiliated, and all of it happened right in front of doctors, nurses, social workers, police officers, pastors, neighbors. Yet, no one truly saw her. Her death forced Britain to confront an ugly truth: that the child protection system was fragmented, understaffed, overly cautious, and bogged down by bureaucracy. Lord Laming's report sparked sweeping reforms, but the wounds it exposed have never truly healed. To this day, the Victoria Clémier case remains a grim warning of what happens when we turn our backs on children, when we find excuses not to act. But beyond the numbers, the reports, the apologies, and the recommendations, Victoria was still just a little girl who spent her final days in agony, fear, and loneliness. That fact alone should haunt us all. Because, as Lord Laming himself said, no child should ever have to endure what Victoria went through. And no adult who came into contact with her can truthfully say they didn't know. Today, on her grave in Grand Bassam, Ivory Coast, there is only a white headstone engraved with her name, Victoria Adjo Clémier. For her parents, Francis and Berthe, the memory of their daughter is still a bleeding wound. But for the rest of the world, her name has come to mean something greater, a reminder that although her life was short, she deserved to be remembered. As we close this story, take a moment to say her name. Look at her face, and ask yourself, if you were the one who saw, would you have had the courage to act? Because somewhere, right now, there's another Victoria. and she can't endure our silence any longer. Thank you for staying with me through today's story. Victoria Clemier is gone, but her suffering remains a stark reminder that we must never turn a blind eye to a child's silent cries for help. If this story moved you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because sometimes even the smallest action can help save a life. See you in the next story.